Well, Dr. Gunn is having a very special time. He was speaking for the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches at their annual meeting, and he had one of the plenary sessions, which means that oftentimes they split up into groups for smaller sessions, but when they get together, for everybody together, well, that's a very special service, and Dr. Gunn was speaking for one of those plenary sessions. And their typical procedure is to send those special speakers out into the churches right afterwards. And so he's speaking at one of the large churches today. I don't know if that continues to next week or not, but if you think about it, you can pray for Dr. Gunn and the ministry he's having. I don't need for you do not need for me to tell you what major changes have been going on in our world. And I'm going to assume that you don't like a lot of them. I tell you, I don't like a lot of them, that's for sure. But I'm thinking in terms of what God is doing. We've known for a long time that there would come a time when God would be preparing for the end of the age, for the return of Jesus Christ. And it's one of the very special times in the providence of God in which He has directed the affairs of men. And we know that there are going to be difficult times before the end. The Scripture speaks of those times. So we may not be too enthusiastic to be living in such a time as this. I think we ought to be very enthusiastic about it. It's a privilege to live in such a time as this. And I want to think this morning about many Christians in many ages who have lived through very special circumstance. God's people live with the character of their era. God works His own plans in the many different eras, and He works in His people during those eras. I am going to think of a metaphor in connection with this thought about the different eras. I'm going to think about our cruise ship. I'm going to think about each one of us being on a cruise ship. The metaphor, as I'm thinking about it, is rather limited. I'm just thinking about the fact that if you're on a cruise ship and you're leaving for Alaska, there are going to be certain ports of call that are going to be different than if you're on a cruise ship that's leaving for the Caribbean. But on cruise ships, there wouldn't be all that many choices. And I'm thinking of all Christians, metaphorically, being on cruise ships, and there are thousands of different courses for those cruise ships. The distinction is that when you're living your life and you got on a cruise ship to the Caribbean, your ports of call are going to be different than the person who's living their life and they got on a cruise ship to Alaska. You can do a lot of things, you can make a lot of choices, but it's still going to land at certain ports, and you will be limited to the things in those ports. What I'm thinking about is the doctrine of the providence of God. God's providence is the way God works out His plan for the world, for mankind, and especially for those He has chosen as His own. We think of our forefathers as being Christian, and indeed many in the founding era of our country were believers in a God. But many of them were deists. Do you know what a deist is? A deist is a person who believes in God, but thinks that God created the world and set it in motion and left it to run on its own. We think of it in terms of the clockmaker. The clockmaker made the clock, but he's not involved in the running in it all the time. In providence, God is involved in nations, in history, and in the lives of individuals in the operation of this world which he has created. As we think about providence, I'm going to think first of all about God working his plan for the earth. God has a broad plan for the earth. In Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8, it says this, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance." The Most High gave the nations their inheritance. When he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Isn't that an interesting thought? God, when he set the boundaries of the nations, took into account the number of the sons of Israel. Now, it's not my purpose to examine how that works out, but God was thinking about Israel in particular when he made the boundaries of all the nations. And if you've done any study of history, you know those boundaries have shifted from time to time. It's interesting to study the way that nations that used to be allied together against other nations shifted around so that different collections were involved. But God is the one who established not only in the beginning, but through time, the boundaries of the nations. God worked his plan by a worldwide flood. That was providence. It had to do, of course, with what was happening on the earth. That was no mystery to God. God worked his plan for Assyria, for Babylon, for Medo-Persia, for Greece, and for Rome. He had Daniel predict so that we could study those things all about these nations. And God was working in all these nations to work out the plan he had for the earth. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and, you got it right, Abednego, had lives that were defined by the era in which they lived. They were no longer living in the promised land. They were living in captivity in another land. And they lived out their lives, and we have the record of splendid things that God worked through them. But it was their assignment by the providence of God. It was different than the assignments of others had been before them, and others would be after them. Ezra lived in a different providence of God. It was after the return from captivity, and he had to do with the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Ezra and Nehemiah were involved in that era, and it was a different era. And the Christians, not Christians, they weren't Christians then, but saints, the saints were constrained by the boundaries of the era in which they lived. God worked out his plan for the Reformation. The Reformation time after the Dark Ages was a unique time in which Martin Luther would play a very important part. And God in his providence worked through the saints in that era. God worked his plan, is going to work his plan for the tribulation and the millennium. And as you read in the scriptures of these things, you know that some very difficult times are coming on the world. Are we leading up to those times? Well, God hasn't given us a revelation. I was listening to a sermon by David Jeremiah. He's about my age. And he was saying that he believes if he lives out his normal life, that he will be here for the rapture of the church. He thinks it's that close. And I take that to mean he thinks it's probably not more than about 10 years off. We can't make predictions of that, can we? But we can see the signs of the times so far as the Jews are concerned, so far as the return of Jesus Christ in power and great glory. And guess what? The rapture of the church is just 7 years earlier. So if you see signs of the return of Jesus Christ for the Jews, move up 7 years and you're seeing times of the time of the rapture of the church. We may very well be living in an era. If we are living in that era, it's going to shape our lives more and more as the days come. So God works his plan for the earth. He also works his plan in the lives of individual people. In Psalm 37:23, it says, "The steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way." In 2 Timothy 4:7, Paul, at the very end of his days on earth, writes, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course." It was a course. He was on the course given him by God. "I have finished the course. I have kept the faith." God, in his providence, had courses for these individuals. Job showed how heavenly secrets change lives. Job didn't have any idea what was going on in heaven, did he? That discussion between Satan and God, that was going to impact his life greatly. He didn't know what was happening. But the providence of God was going to work in Job's life, and he had some marvelous experiences you probably wouldn't care to have, but marvelous experiences because of the providence of God. We'll look a little more extensively at Joseph. Joseph showed a detailed course leading to great deliverance. Joseph had prophetic dreams, which offended his brothers. His brothers took a flock of sheep to a certain place, far from home. Jacob sent Joseph to see how his brothers were doing. His brothers saw him coming from afar off and conspired. Reuben would have rescued Joseph, but Reuben was away when the key time came. A caravan came to the exact location where the brothers had moved the flock. And the Ishmaelites bought Joseph, took him to Egypt, and sold him to Potiphar. God prospered Joseph's work so much that Potiphar put him in charge of everything he owned, of his entire household. Potiphar's wife lusted. Joseph resisted temptation. Joseph landed in jail. It was important for Joseph to land in jail. That was an important part of God's plan. But you think of every step along the way. This whole thing wouldn't have worked without each step going on. God prospered Joseph, and the jailer put him in charge of the jail. Well, that's not quite as great as being put in charge of somebody's household with freedom, but there it was. Pharaoh put his butler and his baker in jail. And guess what? They had prophetic dreams. And Joseph was able to interpret their dreams. And the butler was restored to Pharaoh's household. The baker lost his head. and they forgot about Joseph. But then Pharaoh dreamed a dream. In his dream, he couldn't figure out what it was all about. But it was a prophetic dream, and it had to do with 7 years of prosperity and 7 years of famine. He didn't know that. But the butler remembered Joseph because the butler had been in jail and had been the object of some dreams and an interpretation. So Pharaoh brought Joseph to the palace to interpret his dream. And the nature of the prophesied events moved Pharaoh to exalt Joseph. And so he became the second in power in Egypt. World events brought Israel into Egypt, and there in Egypt, Israel grew into a nation, while life in Canaan was becoming more and more anti-God. So it would be just of God to slaughter all the population in Canaan and give that land to Israel. God in providence was working in great detail over a long period of time in the life of Joseph. Now, I don't tell you that to say that you're going to have a life like that or I'm going to have a life like that. But God does work in our lives, and it can sometimes be quite detailed as to what He is doing in our lives. Jonah had a unique life, didn't he? And he showed the foolishness of doing what? Resisting God. He resisted God, didn't want to do what God wanted him to do. God had a plan. Jonah didn't like the plan. How'd that work out? Not very good at all, did it? Manasseh, you remember Manasseh? He's kind of a favorite with me. He showed us the blessings of repentance. In 2 Kings 21, at verse 2, it says, "He did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places, which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. And he erected altars for Baal, and he made Asherah." Asherah are idols that are used in the worship of false gods. He worshipped all the host of heaven. He was a star worshiper. And he served them. He built altars. You know where he built them? In God's house. He made his son pass through the fire. That was a religious ceremony when you showed how devoted you were to God because you took your son and put him on the altar and burned him. He practiced witchcraft and he used divination. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Then he set a carved image of Asherah that he made in the house of the Lord. It's one thing to make an idol. It's another thing to put it right there in the house of the Lord. What's this fellow's name? Do you remember? It's Manasseh. What do you think? Pretty good king? Lousy king. Terrible, wicked king. But 2 Chronicles 33, 10 and 11 says, "The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore the Lord brought the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria against them, and they captured Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze chains, and took him to Babylon." In Manasseh, right? But then you read in 2 Chronicles 33:12, "When he was in distress, he entreated the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. When he prayed to him, he was moved by his entreaty, and heard his supplication, and brought him again to Jerusalem, to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. That's a remarkable plan in God's providence for Manasseh. Saul, who became Paul, showed a life with much suffering. So in Acts 9, 15 and 16 we read, "But the Lord said to him, 'Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel, for I will show him how he must suffer for my name's sake.'" God, in his providence, had a plan for Saul, who became Paul. What was his plan? Well, he was going to bear testimony before kings. Well, that's a good thing, right? But it was also that he was going to suffer. God, in his providence, planned for Paul to suffer. That's not unique. Each of these people were restrained and constrained by God's providence. Some of them made good choices and they were blessed for them. Some of them made bad choices and they suffered for them. And God in his providence worked in each of these lives. Now, I'm not trying to be snide when I say none of them could be whatever he wanted to be. In each of these lives, you'll see that they were within a certain course of action which God had prepared for each one. It's like they were on this cruise ship and they were going to visit certain ports and they could do a lot of things. They could make choices about this, that, and the other thing, but they couldn't make choices about where the ship went to port. And if you're Jonah, you're going to end up in Nineveh, like it or not. And if you're Paul, you're going to have a life of suffering. And it'd be a good idea if you like it. Because this is God's plan for you in his providence. And every one of us is on a course in life in which God's providence is controlling. And I suspect that our cruise ship is cruising up right to the end of the age before the rapture of the church. I said, I suspect that. So, we have some good things that we can do in interfacing with God's providence. God's providence is the operation in the history of the world, nations. God's providence is at work in the lives of individuals. And as we live our lives, we are under the constraint of the providence that God has prepared for us. What can we do about that? First, I suggest to you that we freely embrace the things that God has determined. Don't be like Jonah. Don't resist what God is doing. You say, I don't like it when the doctor says I've got cancer. I started to say tough, but that's not what I mean. If God has planned to glorify his name and work in you and in his world through you having cancer, the best thing you can do is embrace it and see how you can glorify God in what is going on in your life. Embrace the things that God has determined. Each of us has a course laid out. We have certain physical and mental abilities. Some of us not so much. You never believe this, but I was tall. And people used to always ask me about playing basketball. I was tall, but I was not coordinated. God didn't design me to play basketball. I have some abilities, but I have some disabilities too. And I suspect that that's true of every one of us here. We work within the physical and mental abilities that God gives us. We work within the framework of our upbringing and education. I was raised by a very, demanding, severe father. That's the way God formed me into the life that he wanted me to live. He made me what he wanted me to be. Praise his name. And you had your own upbringing and whatever that was, and God prepared you for what he wants you to be. Your health and your length of life. I had a very good friend. His name was Rex Furman. And we did a lot of things together for about 50 years. And he did marvelous things, far more than I ever did, in the service of Christ. He passed away about going on 3 weeks ago now. And he was 5 years younger than I am. So his length of life, in spite of all the skills he used and the ability he had, was cut short. Matter of fact, it was cut short a few years earlier than that because he got dementia. And he could no longer do the things he could do when he was younger. It frustrated him no end. He wanted so much to serve God. He says, what can I do? I'm useless. But you know what? That was God's providence. God planned that for him. His father before him had the same problem. So, we all live lives within different parameters of the things that God prepared for us. I heard a sermon on providence. That's what triggered this. Wasn't this sermon. It wasn't anything like this sermon. Far better than this. But it made me think about some frustrations I've had all my life that I shouldn't have had. I was at seminary at the same time as another student, very talented student. He now preaches to millions of people. I don't. I thought, what's wrong with me? That I didn't do like he did. But you know what? All along the way, God prepared him for that. That was his course. That was God's providence. And I'm feeling a whole lot better now when I realize that God prepared me for a different course. God expects from each one of us the best we can do within the scope of what he has prepared for us. The cruise ship that he put us on. He doesn't expect us when we're in the Caribbean to get off in Anchorage, Alaska. Not going to happen. And he doesn't expect us when he's prepared us to minister to a small group of people to do the same thing as someone that he prepared to minister to millions of people. Doesn't mean that one is doing more and the other is doing less. It depends upon how we are operating within the scope of God's providence for our lives. So, embrace the things God has determined. some things we choose. We should choose to accept his limits. Rehoboam had to accept God's limits. 2 Chronicles 11:4. Thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives. Return every man to his house, for this thing is from me. So they listened to the words of the Lord and returned from going against Jeroboam. Rehoboam was frustrated. You know who his father was? His father was Solomon. Solomon reigned over the nations. Rehoboam just wanted to have the 12 tribes. He ended up with one. The plus one, his own tribe and one more. He went to war. He wanted to capture back the 10 tribes that had left. God said, stop it. Why did he not get the 12 tribes? It was because of something Solomon did. Solomon did evil. And God judged him and said, I'm going to take the 10 tribes away from you. They won't be in your following lives of kings. And so Rehoboam was limited. He had to accept his limits. We need to accept our limits too. We need to follow his instructions. In Isaiah 54, at verse 14, it says, in righteousness you will be established. You will be far from oppression, for you will not fear, and from terror, for it will not come near you. If anyone fiercely assails you, it will not be from me. Whoever assails you will fall because of you. Behold, I myself have created the smith, who blows the fire of coals and brings out a weapon for its work. And I have created the destroyer to ruin. No weapon that is formed against you will prosper, and every tongue that accuses you in judgment you will condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their vindication is from me, declares the Lord. In righteousness you will be established. Follow his instructions. Be careful to live the way that he instructs you to live and me to live. Follow his instructions. Not only do we need to accept his limits, follow his instructions, we also need to treasure his wisdom. Proverbs 3, my son, verse 21, let them not vanish from your sight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so they will be the life to your soul and adornment to your neck. Then you will walk in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the onslaught of the wicked when it comes. For the Lord will be your confidence, and will be your foot, and will keep your foot from being caught. Treasure his wisdom. Romans 11:33. Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, or who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him, and through him, and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. The wisdom of God is partly to exalt Jesus Christ above all. So, accept his limits, follow his instructions, treasure his wisdom, rejoice in his choices. God, in his providence, has made choices for you. Philippians 4:4 says, rejoice in the Lord most of the time. Oh, you know better than that, don't you? What's it say? Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I will say, rejoice. How can we do that? How can we rejoice in the Lord always? Lots of things come into our lives. Because God is controlling the things that come into our lives. And unless it's the result of our rebellion and our foolishness, then it's going to be good. All things work together for good. Isn't that what it says in Romans chapter 8? So, rejoice in his choices. He preserves the way of his godly ones. Proverbs 3:6 has been a favorite of mine for many years. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will what? Direct your paths. Rejoice in his choices. Another suggestion is that we fear offending him. 1 Kings 11:4 concerning Solomon. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Verse 11. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. That would be Jeroboam, who took the 10 tribes, and the reason Rehoboam had to be limited to just the 2. Another suggestion is that we embrace suffering. Embrace suffering. That's a hard one. Luke 21:16 says, but you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not a hair of your head will perish. They're going to put you to death, but not a hair of your head's going to perish. What does that mean? When they put you to death, it won't be perishing. It'll be a promotion to glory. And not a single hair of your head is going to perish. That was God's providence he was talking about. Matthew 5:11 and 12. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad. Is he serious about that? Is that something we can embrace? Rejoice and be glad. For your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets. Then Romans 8:28, for we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. God has a plan and a purpose for your life and for my life. If, like Saul, it means suffering many things for his name's sake, that will be best, and he will bless us in it. If, like David, God appointed you for great things, well, then that will be best. If, like most of us, God prepared you for ordinary things, then rejoice that God has prepared you for that life. It's his providence. It is best. Our best course is to love and serve God faithfully, not strive for things he has not purposed for us, and rejoice. God's providence